Hello. This video is going to take you through some basics to do with Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant and their various ethical theories. Shout out to Daisy, who requested this one and who specifically requested a shout out. So there you go. Just before we get into it, I'm not going to be looking here at compatibility with Christianity. I'm going to try and do a separate video for that because that's a little bit more involved. So I'll just try and keep it nice and quick today and take you through the basics of each of the two of them. So before we start, here are the main key differences. Now, Bentham and Kant, in terms of their ethical theories, they don't have a huge amount in common. There are some similarities, one of which is that they're both secular ethics rather than being based on anything to do with religion. That's not 100% true of Kant, although it depends how you interpret various bits of his theory, but I'll come on to that. So just to take you through it quickly, Bentham is very teleological, very consequentialist, so it's looking at outcomes. Kant's ethics is very deontological, very rule-based, very much based on duty. In terms of what they consider to be intrinsically good, that is good in itself. For Bentham, this is pleasure or happiness. For Kant, that's not relevant. The only intrinsic good is a goodwill. And I'll talk later on about what exactly Kant means by goodwill. Therefore, in terms of rules, we've got very different approaches again. For Bentham, you make decisions quite situationally. Each situation needs to be considered in its own right. You need to look at each set of circumstances to figure out the greatest good for the greatest number. Kant doesn't do that at all. His rules, once you've arrived at them, are absolute and exceptionless. So let's look at Bentham in a little bit more depth. So act utilitarianism is his sort of first version that he wrote about. And it's called act utilitarianism because the basis behind it is that you do every act, every action based on what is the greatest good for the greatest number. The greatest good for the greatest number, which keeps coming up in utilitarianism, that's called the principle of utility. So Bentham believed that being ethical, the nature of what is good, is about maximising the amount of pleasure in the world and minimising the amount of pain. Now, you will have come across this already in metaethics, because from a metaethical point of view, Bentham's utilitarianism is a great example of ethical naturalism. That meaning that good and bad is grounded in things that we can experience and understand. So good is pleasure, bad is pain. In terms of how you work this out, he's got a tool called the hedonic calculus. That sounds a lot fancier than it actually is. It's just a set of criteria for how you measure happiness. And I've got a little bit about it on the next slide. In terms of rules, Bentham's not against rules per se, but they should only be obeyed if doing so brings about the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. So if you've got an existing rule or a social norm, if obeying it brings about the greatest good for the greatest number, you obey it. If breaking it brings about the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, you should break it. So it's very consequentialist. You're always trying to get to this place where you've got the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. It's worth saying as well, Bentham doesn't just include people in this theory. He thought utilitarianism should apply to animals as well. His criteria was, if it's capable of feeling pleasure and pain, it deserves to be taken into ethical consideration. That's another big difference between him and Kant. Kant doesn't do that. Kant's ethical theory is very much based on humans because only humans can be rational. Quick look at the hedonic calculus then. You might have a little hack for remembering this. You get different versions of it, but this is the one that I like to use. So we've got intensity, certainty, duration, propinquity. You may be using a different word for that. Some people call it remoteness. It's just about how near or far away is the pleasure. Fecundity is again a bit of a funny word. It's to do with sort of the richness and how likely is it to lead to more pleasure. Purity, extent, those are fairly self-explanatory. So what Bentham would do is, when considering a moral decision, such as whether to tell a lie, whether to get an abortion, whether to experiment on animals, you would weigh it up using this calculus. So how much pleasure are you going to get from this action? If you can calculate the greatest amount of pleasure, that tells you what the right action is. So a few brief strengths and weaknesses of Bentham. There are more than these, but I'm trying to go quite fast here. It's democratic, so the majority tends to win out because you're going for the greatest good for the greatest number. But the problem with that is you always end up with a minority who are potentially going to be ignored or oppressed, or who don't get their own way. It's flexible, it's teleological, it's adaptable. We can probably all think of times when following rules does not maximize happiness. But rules tend to be quite safe, and that's quite important. Rules and duties are seen as being as maybe not of no importance, but of very little importance. And also, we can't predict consequences. Any consequentialist theory is always a little bit dangerous because you can't always know how your actions are going to turn out. Everyone wants to be happy, so it's reasonable to base ethics on happiness. Yes, but you could argue that that's an example of the naturalistic fallacy. Just because we enjoy pleasure, it doesn't mean that we ought to maximize pleasure. Just because something is a certain way, it doesn't necessarily follow that it ought to be that way. You'll have come across the naturalistic fallacy probably elsewhere in the course as well. Okay. Bentham is a little bit more straightforward than Kant. Don't let Kant freak you out. There's a lot of technical language. It's quite dense, but there's a way to make it simple, and we're going to try and do that. So here's a few key terms for you. Categorical imperative is Kant's sense of an absolute unbreakable moral command. And we're going to walk through how you come up with a categorical imperative, how you decide what one is. A hypothetical imperative, Kant talks about these as well, but this isn't really to do with what you must do as your ethical duty. This is more to do with things like, if I want something, then I need to do this. So this is more about yourself and what you want. And that's not the key part of his ethics. The summum bonum, this is what he sees as the supreme good, the ultimate reward, the highest kind of happiness. We'll talk more about Kant and happiness in a minute, because he's got a very different view than Bentham on it. Universalizability, can you universalize something? So this is a test for whether something is a categorical imperative. You have to ask yourself, would you be okay if everyone was doing the thing you're considering? Again, I'll take you through an example of that. And then finally, a postulate. This is an assumption that is made in order to make sense of moral choices. So Kant's got three postulates: God, immortality, and free will. Now, I said before that this isn't a secular ethical theory, and it is, in the sense that everybody can do it. But to take it all the way through to the end, Kant is admitting that we can't prove that these things are real, God, immortality, and free will, but he thinks they are in order for all of this to work. So again, in my second video on this, I'm going to talk about compatibility with Christianity. In some ways, Kant's compatible, in some ways he's not. We'll come on to that another time. Right, so let me take you through the basics. Kant believed that everyone has or had an inbuilt sense of moral duty. He thinks that that's part of being human. So a rational person should always want to do right because they are a rational person. That's part of being rational. If you don't want to do right, if you don't want to do the right thing, if you don't want to be moral, if you don't care about that, Kant sees that as completely irrational. But he believes that people basically are rational. So despite the fact that he believes in God, he thinks that this can't be imposed by God. because it's just part of how we are, it's part of our human reason. This is quite important because it makes it universal and secular. In other words, being able to follow Kantian ethics is not dependent on being religious. Anybody can theoretically be a Kantian. They can follow his ethics. Doesn't matter if you believe in God or not. Now, coming back to this idea of a goodwill, Kant defines a goodwill as being right motivation or right motive and a sense of duty, this idea that you have to do certain things. So this means that once you've figured out what the moral principles are, they must always be obeyed because you simply have a duty to obey them. And to not obey them would be completely irrational. So you can see already we're quite a long way away from what Bentham was thinking. I apologise, this bit's a bit wordy, but bear with me. Slow it down, pause it if you need to, write bits down, whatever you feel like you want to do. So Kant's categorical imperative, this is the main part of his ethics. This comes in kind of three different strands. So first of all, to find out if something is a categorical imperative, to find out if it's a moral rule that must always be followed, you have to think about the universalizability principle. So you should act only according to that maxim where you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law. A maxim is just kind of like a statement or a proposition. So we could take lying, for example, here. If you're considering telling a lie and you're a Kantian, you have to ask yourself with the universalizability principle, how would I feel if everybody told lies all the time? How would I feel if that became a universal law? If it's not okay to imagine living in a world where everybody told lies all the time, I can't tell a lie. Therefore, not lying becomes a categorical imperative. Not breaking promises becomes a categorical imperative because you wouldn't want to live in a world where people did this all the time. That's the most important one. Next is what we call the practical imperative. This is about how to treat people. You should act in such a way that you treat humanity never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So in Kant's ethical thinking, it's not okay to manipulate people. It doesn't mean that you can't use somebody as a means to achieve something because society is built on this. So for example, you're kind of using me as a means of understanding what Kant is on about right now. But I'm okay with that because I know that that's what's happening and I'm not being manipulated. But you should at the same time treat people as ends, treat them as free moral agents. You shouldn't just look to take advantage of them. And then related to this idea of the kingdom of ends. This is asking you to imagine that you're the ruler of a kingdom in which you always treat people as ends in themselves, and you've got to act as if you're responsible for making the rules for that kingdom. So in everything that you do, you have to think, is this universalizable? How would I feel if everybody did this? Am I treating people as ends in themselves? This is what you have to think about. It's not dead straightforward, but keep reading it, keep thinking about it, and it should click. Now, where Kant is ultimately going with this is this idea of the summum bonum. So the summum bonum, this is what he sees as the highest good. It's a little bit like eudaimonia, but try not to see them as the same thing because they aren't really. So for Kant, this is underpinned by these three postulates we talked about: God, freedom, immortality. And a big difference from Bentham here, humans shouldn't strive to be happy. The point of life isn't to be happy. The point of life is to be worthy of happiness, to be good enough to make yourself kind of deserve to be happy. If you are happy along the way, that's a bonus. But it is just a bonus. It shouldn't be the end. It shouldn't be the aim. Morality is internal. So the highest good isn't kind of out there for you to go and find. You have to create it. You have to will the highest good. You have to want it. That is, as an independent person, as a free moral agent, you have to believe that if you act morally, you'll be worthy of happiness. In other words, if you do your duty, you will get closer to this idea of the summum bonum. Now, this is where it gets a little bit religious. So for secular thinkers, they have to kind of park it here, really. Kant reasoned that for the summum bonum to exist, for life to be made completely fair, there has to be immortality, because we don't necessarily get rewarded in this life. If there's immortality, there must be something to provide the immortality, so he thought God must exist. And we must also be acting freely. Now, he can't prove that we are, but he doesn't think that any of this makes sense if we're not free. And he's probably right, because how can you have a good will, a truly good will, if you're not freely choosing that? Okay, we're nearly there. Let's just look at a few strengths and weaknesses. So on the one hand, once you understand it, it's very clear. Once you can figure out what the categorical imperatives are, you know what to do. There's no kind of wiggle room with that. But a weakness of that is maybe there needs to be some wiggle room. Morality is very complex. The world is very complex. In theory, possibly if everybody signed up to be a Kantian, we could make it work. But that's not the world we live in. So therefore, if everybody's not buying in, nobody can really buy in. That's the weakness there. You could argue a strength is that it's very, very rational, it's unemotional, so it's objective and it's fair. Bentham's ethics being all about pleasure is potentially a little bit iffy. But can we really park our emotions completely when we're making moral decisions? Surely being emotional is part of being human. Treating people as ends, not just a means to an end, on the face of it, that seems very good. It promotes equality, it promotes justice. But it's very anthropocentric. It's only about us. It's only about humans, and at that, rational humans. Now, not every human is capable of being rational, because there's all sorts of reasons why somebody might not be able to be rational. And also, what about animals? Bentham does take into account animals. So you could say broadly, that's more ethical. The summum bonum makes it clear what morality is all about, where it's going. It makes it compatible with religion. But, like I said before, if you're an atheist, the whole summum bonum thing doesn't really work, because it's not clear that God exists. It's not clear we have immortality. So an atheist might be able to get on board with reason and logic and the categorical imperative, but they wouldn't really be able to take it further than that. Okay, there's your basics on Bentham and Kant. Like I say, I'm going to try and do a video on compatibility with Christianity, but that's potentially a little bit more of a longer one. Don't panic if you're struggling with Bentham and Kant. Ask for help, take it back to the basics, focus on what you do understand rather than what you don't understand, because just having the basics might be enough to do quite a lot with it. So don't worry, happy revision, and I'll see you next time.